I had been planning this solo hiking trip for almost 6 months. My work had gotten too overwhelming lately. Long hours behind a desk, fluorescent lights buzzing over my head, screens burning my eyes out day after day. I was tired, mentally drained, and just needed to get away. I chose a long, demanding trail I had read about in an old hiking forum. It wasn't one of those well-known tourist trails. It was rugged, remote, and not maintained as well as others, which was exactly why I picked it. I didn't want crowds. I wanted silence. I wanted something to test me, something real. The trail was located in the northern part of Idaho, close to the border with Montana. It cut through a stretch of deep forest that climbed into the mountain ranges, then wrapped around several ridgelines before looping back down into the valley. It wasn't marked officially, but people who'd hiked it said it could be done in 3 or 4 days. I packed for 6, just in case. I brought everything I could think of: extra batteries, headlamps, 2 knives, a first aid kit with more than I'd probably need, waterproof matches, fire starters, a power bank, an emergency beacon, 2 compasses, and enough food to last a week. I carried a filter pump for water, a small lightweight tent, and a solid pair of boots I had broken in the month before. I parked my car in a small gravel lot by the trailhead. There was no one else there, no sign of fresh tire tracks. It was late September. The temperature was mild, the air dry, and the forecast showed no rain. I locked up the car, checked all my gear, took a deep breath, and started walking. The trail started off steep right away. Pines surrounded me on both sides, thick, tall, and dark green. The scent of sap and old earth was heavy in the air. The path was narrow, mostly dirt with rocks scattered along the way. Occasionally, I had to duck under fallen branches or step over logs. But the solitude was amazing. By late afternoon, I had made it about 10 miles in. I found a flat area near a stream and set up camp. The water was ice cold and clear. I filtered some into my bottle, boiled a small pot to be extra safe, and made some dehydrated chili. I sat against a tree, eating in silence while watching the colors of the forest darken. That first night was peaceful, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the low gurgling of the stream nearby. The second day, the terrain got rougher. The trail curved upward, climbing fast. I had to use both hands at times to steady myself, gripping tree roots or rocks to pull myself up. My thighs burned, and I was sweating despite the cold breeze. The higher I climbed, the thinner the air felt. I wasn't in dangerous elevation yet, but I could feel the difference. Around midday, I stopped to rest. I sat on a rock, ate some trail mix, and studied my map. According to the printout and GPS, I was still on track. But when I looked around, something felt slightly off. The trees here were thinner, and there was a weird silence. No birds, no bugs, just wind. It wasn't anything supernatural, just eerie. Still, I kept going. A few hours later, I made it to the first ridgeline. The views were incredible, layers of mountains stacked against each other, deep valleys below, and clouds floating low over distant peaks. I stood there for a long time just staring, but I didn't want to waste daylight. I kept moving. That evening, I set up camp on a ledge a bit down from the ridge. I was exhausted. My legs ached. I could feel my heartbeat in my knees. I cooked a meal and climbed into my sleeping bag before it was fully dark. I didn't sleep well, though. I kept waking up to strange sounds. Not animals, more like snapping sticks and crunching leaves just barely out of earshot. I kept telling myself it was probably deer or a raccoon, but the noises didn't move like an animal. They were slow. One crunch, then silence, then another minutes later. I stayed in my tent, holding my knife, not moving a muscle. Eventually, I must have dozed off. The next morning, I stepped out and checked around. Nothing. No tracks. No sign of anything near my tent. I shook it off and pushed forward. That third day was the worst. The trail on the next ridgeline was barely visible. It looked like no one had walked it in years. Vegetation grew over it. Sometimes I had to crouch through thickets or climb over fallen trees. I slipped more than once scraping my elbow badly on a rock. It bled, and I had to stop and clean it out with my first aid kit. I started getting frustrated. My boots were soaked from a small bog I hadn't noticed until I stepped right into it. By mid-afternoon, the wind had picked up. Clouds were rolling in. Dark, thick clouds. I knew there wasn't supposed to be rain, but weather in the mountains can change fast. I picked up the pace, hoping to find a good spot to camp before anything hit. That's when I realized I hadn't seen any trail markers for hours. No cairns, no ribbons on trees. I pulled out my map, checked the GPS, and everything still said I was in the right place, but my gut was screaming otherwise. The trees looked unfamiliar. The ridgeline was rockier than the one on the map, and the trail, if it was still a trail, was almost gone. Still, I had to keep going. I came across what looked like an old camp spot, flat ground, some blackened rocks from a fire pit, and a few scraps of weathered tarp tangled in some branches. That's where I made my mistake. I decided to stay there for the night, figuring I'd retrace my steps in the morning or try to reconnect to the trail if it curved around. I ate a cold meal. I didn't want to light a fire. Something about that place didn't sit right with me. The wind whistled through the trees like a low scream, and every sound felt magnified. I barely slept. At one point, I heard what sounded like someone breathing outside the tent. Not walking, just breathing. Low, shaky, and close. I didn't dare move. I gripped my knife under my sleeping bag and just lay still for what felt like hours. When I finally looked out, nothing was there. But that didn't help. The next morning, I packed up quickly and tried to backtrack. But nothing looked familiar. Trees I swore I'd passed before were gone. The ridge I had climbed seemed higher now. I started hiking in circles without realizing it. By noon, I was completely off trail. I turned on my emergency beacon. It was supposed to send out a signal every hour with my GPS coordinates. But I wasn't sure how reliable it was way out here. I climbed the nearest rise to get a better signal and waited. Nothing happened. No buzzing. No lights. Just the same dead silence around me. Then the fog rolled in. Thick, white fog moving in fast. Within minutes, I couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. Everything turned into shadow. I felt panic creeping in. I started walking slowly, trying not to trip or twist my ankle. But visibility was terrible, and the ground was uneven. I slipped again, falling hard onto my side. I felt a crack. Pain exploded in my ribs. I couldn't breathe for a moment. I just lay there, trying not to pass out. Eventually, the pain dulled. I tried standing. It hurt, but I could walk. I wrapped my ribs as best I could and kept moving. The fog never lifted. The air felt thick and wet. Every breath was cold in my lungs. I hiked through the fog for what felt like hours, but it was probably just one. I found another clearing and stopped. I needed to rest. That's when I noticed something. A piece of blue fabric caught on a branch. It looked newer than anything else I'd seen out here. I walked up to it, pulled it free, and realized it was part of a backpack strap. That's when I saw the boot. It was lying on its side, torn open. The laces were shredded, and beside it, the edge of a torn sleeping bag, half buried in leaves. I froze. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I followed the bits of gear, scattered and old-looking but not rotten. They led into a thicket. That's where I found the skeleton. It was partly covered by dirt and moss. The clothes were faded, torn, and looked like they had been out here for years. The pack beside it had a patch with a name I couldn't read. I didn't touch anything. I just backed away slowly. I had to get out. Now, I turned around and walked fast. I didn't care if I was off trail. I didn't care about my route. I just wanted down. Lower elevation. Any sign of people. Roads. Smoke. Anything. By the 5th day, I was out of food. My ribs still ached. My hands were scraped and bleeding. My face was sunburned. I was down to half a bottle of water, and the streams I passed looked too risky to drink from without boiling. The terrain started to drop. Finally, the trees began to change. More open ground. Then I heard something I hadn't heard in days, traffic. Faint and distant, but real. I climbed down through loose gravel, slid more than I walked, and eventually broke through the trees onto a narrow road. Asphalt. Civilization. About 2 hours later, a ranger found me sitting on the shoulder, legs covered in dirt and dried blood, holding my pack like it was the last thing tying me to earth. They got me to a hospital. I was 34 when I decided to hike alone for the first time. I had always done it with friends or joined guided groups in the past, but something about being completely on my own started to feel important. Like I had to prove something to myself. I wasn't in a bad place in life or anything like that. I just felt a need to disconnect. No phones, no emails, no background noise. I just wanted to walk into the forest with a backpack and nothing but time. It was the first week of September when I set out. The weather had just started cooling down, but the days were still warm and dry. I picked a state forest in northern Idaho, a place I had researched for weeks. It wasn't a national park, so it was less crowded, and the terrain wasn't overly challenging, which was perfect for what I wanted. A long, quiet, multi-day solo hike. I planned a loop that would take me about 4 days to complete if I stuck to the trails, though I packed enough food for 6 days just in case. I started early in the morning, parked my car in a gravel pullout near the main trailhead, and signed into the logbook at the information board. That was the last time I would see any sign of another human being for days. The first day was easy. The forest was beautiful. Tall pines, filtered sunlight, and a steady, soft wind that made the trees whisper just loud enough to keep the silence from feeling too heavy. I walked for hours, checking my paper map now and then. I carried a compass and knew how to use it, but the trails were well marked and I was in no hurry. That night, I set up camp near a small stream. I boiled water, made some instant rice and beans, and stretched out on my sleeping pad as the stars came out. I had this odd feeling, like I was being watched, but I told myself it was just my mind adjusting to the quiet. I wasn't used to being that far from people. It was nothing more than nerves. The next morning, I broke camp and continued on. Day 2 was steeper. I climbed switchbacks for hours, feeling the burn in my legs and lungs, but it felt good. It reminded me I was still alive, still strong. I reached a clearing at the top of a ridge by midday and sat on a flat rock to eat some trail mix and jerky. The view stretched for miles, hills and valleys covered in green, with no towns or roads in sight. Somewhere in that stillness, something shifted. I didn't see anything move, didn't hear anything unusual, but a feeling crept up from my stomach, a strange unease that tightened in my chest. It didn't make sense. There was no danger I could see or hear, but something inside me started saying I shouldn't be there. I shook it off and pushed forward. I had a long way to go before I reached my next planned campsite. The trail narrowed in spots and got rougher, with more fallen branches and loose stones. I passed a couple of unmarked paths that veered off into the trees, probably made by animals or old logging routes. I didn't pay them much attention. That night, I camped in a shallow ravine. I was tired enough to sleep through anything, but I didn't. I kept waking up, once to pee, once because I thought I heard something moving just outside my tent. Another time because I was sure I'd heard something snap, like a branch being stepped on. Each time, I unzipped the flap and stuck my head out. There was never anything there. By morning, I was groggy and tense, but I kept going. The trail was supposed to loop down toward a lake and then cut east before circling back north toward the parking area. By midday, I reached the lake. That's where everything changed. I sat on the shore and studied the map. The trail continued on the far side of the lake, and I could see it in the distance. But there was no clear way around the lake unless I backtracked a good half-mile and then took a wide detour. I decided to bushwhack a shortcut through the woods along the shoreline. It didn't look that far, and the woods weren't dense. First, it was easy. I stayed near the water, stepping over roots and ducking under low branches. But the bank started to get soft and muddy, and I had to move further inland. That's when I lost the trail. I tried to angle back toward where I thought it would be, but the terrain didn't line up with what I expected. I checked my compass and headed east, thinking I'd meet the trail again soon. I didn't. I walked for what felt like an hour before I admitted to myself I was lost. I stopped, took off my pack, and sat on a stump. I pulled out my map and tried to retrace my steps, but none of it looked right. I could see the lake behind me through the trees, but the shoreline didn't match the curves on the map. I figured I wasn't far off. I'd just keep heading east, slowly, and I'd cross the trail eventually. I kept walking. The ground got rougher. The trees were thicker. There were no trail markers, no signs of foot traffic. I found animal tracks, maybe deer, maybe something bigger. I started to feel the unease again, worse this time, like the woods were folding in on me. By evening, I still hadn't found the trail. I was too tired to keep going. I set up my tent on a patch of dry, level ground and tried to eat, but my stomach was tight. I kept listening. Every twig snap, every rustle in the underbrush made me freeze. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I told myself I'd climb higher. If I could get above the tree line, I might spot a landmark, maybe the lake or even the trail. I packed up and hiked uphill. The climb was brutal. My legs felt heavy, and I was running low on water. I had my filter, but no running streams nearby. I kept pushing. When I reached a rise, I saw nothing familiar. No lake, no trail, just more trees, more hills. I tried to use the sun to guide me, but the sky had clouded over. I wasn't even sure what direction I was facing anymore. That's when I started to panic. Not full-on screaming or running kind of panic, but a creeping, slow kind. The kind that starts deep in your brain and claws its way out. I knew I had food for a couple more days, but the fear wasn't about that. It was the isolation, the way the forest felt wrong, like it was swallowing me. I started walking again, faster now, hoping I'd cross something. I didn't. I tripped more than once, scraped my hands and knees on rocks. My clothes got torn. The light started fading, and I realized I didn't know how many miles I had walked or in what direction. That night, I didn't set up the tent. I was too exhausted. I lay under a tree with my pack for a pillow, wrapped in my emergency blanket, listening. Every single sound made my heart jump. The forest was alive, and I wasn't part of it. I was a mistake, an intruder. I think I slept for an hour total. The next morning, I woke up shaking. I hadn't eaten since the day before. I forced down some trail mix and drank the last of my filtered water. I had to find a stream. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I needed water. I followed the slope of the land, hoping downhill would lead me to water. After about an hour, I heard it, a trickle. I ran to it. It was barely more than a muddy flow, but I used my filter and drank until I felt sick. I filled my bottles and rested there. While sitting by the water, I saw something in the mud across the stream. A boot print, faint but real. I jumped up and crossed the stream to look. It was old, maybe a few days, but it was proof someone had been there. I followed it. Then I found another, then two more. A trail. Not man-made, but a game trail, maybe used by hunters. I followed it. Not fast. I didn't want to miss anything. Curved and dipped and climbed for hours, but I kept moving. I started seeing signs. Broken branches, footprints, even a wrapper half buried in dirt. Trash meant people, and people meant help. The sun was setting again when I saw it. Post. Just a short wooden post with a weathered red mark. A trail marker. I almost cried. I dropped to my knees and just sat there. It wasn't the trail I had started on, but it was a trail. I had a chance now. I camped right there, ate the last of my jerky, slept harder than I had in days. By morning, I felt clear-headed again. I followed the trail for hours until I found a junction. There was a rusted sign. One arrow pointed left and read, Trailhead 6.2 miles. The other said, Lake 3.1 miles. I had done it. I was back on the map. I walked until my feet went numb. When I finally saw the parking area and my car in the distance, I broke into a half jog. My legs didn't want to move like that, but I didn't care. I reached my car, unlocked it, and sat inside with the door open, breathing like I just escaped something I couldn't explain. I drove to the nearest ranger station and told them I'd gone off trail, got lost, and reconnected with another path. They took my name and told me I was lucky. I didn't tell them about the fear, about the way the forest felt wrong. I didn't think they'd understand. When I got home, I looked at the map again. I tried to figure out where I had gone. No matter how I traced it, the distances didn't add up. I should have crossed more trails. I should have seen more signs of people. But there was nothing. It was like I'd been walking in a pocket of forest no one used anymore. a forgotten place that didn't want me there. I still hike, but never alone. Not again. I don't need to prove anything anymore. I had been hiking alone for years, not because I didn't have friends or anyone to go with, but because I liked the silence. I liked the challenge. When you're out there by yourself, you move at your own pace. You think more clearly. You watch everything. Every crunch of leaves underfoot, every gust of wind brushing the back of your neck, every shadow shifting across the rocks. They all feel sharper when you're the only one out there. That was part of the draw. This trip was supposed to be just another solo hike. I had picked a new area this time, a place I had only read about on a blog. A guy had written about this narrow ridge trail somewhere deep in the Idaho backcountry, west of the Salmon River. It wasn't part of any major park, and it wasn't well known. The way he described it, almost like a secret, got me curious. He said the trail was steep, remote, and underused. The ridge supposedly offered a panoramic view of 2 river valleys on either side, but it was easy to get turned around if you weren't careful. That didn't bother me. I always carried maps. I knew how to use a compass. I had a GPS, backup batteries, and plenty of food. I took time off work and flew out to Boise, then drove 6 hours north in a rental car to a small town I can't even remember the name of now. I had marked the rough location of the trailhead from the blog. It wasn't on Google Maps, just a dirt pull-off near a Forest Service road. I slept in the car the night before I started. I remember waking up before dawn, cold air, mist on the windshield, the smell of pine, the kind of morning that tells you it's going to be a good hike. At least that's what I thought. I loaded my pack with 5 days worth of food, a small tent, cooking gear, and my emergency kit. I didn't plan to be gone that long, 3 nights at most, but I always carried extra just in case. I left a note on the dashboard saying where I'd gone and when I expected to return. I double-checked the location of the ridge on my printed map and took a picture of it with my phone for good measure. I also dropped a waypoint on my GPS where the car was parked. The first part of the hike went smoothly. The trail was rough, barely a trail at all in places, but I liked that. It meant fewer people came this way. I saw no signs of human activity past the first hour. No trash, no footprints, not even an old fire ring. The path climbed steeply through thick pines for most of the first day. I stopped only to refill my water at a creek and eat a quick lunch. By late afternoon, I reached a plateau. The trees thinned out there, and I got my first look at the ridge. It was long and narrow with steep drops on both sides. It looked exactly like the photo on the blog, except more intimidating in person. The sun was already starting to dip, so I pitched my tent on the flattest spot I could find and boiled water for dinner. That night was calm, cold but calm. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind move through the trees and rocks above me. I remember feeling relaxed. I even wrote a short journal entry on my phone, something I usually forgot to do. Nothing about that first night made me think I'd made a mistake coming out here. Nothing at all. The next morning, I packed up early and pushed on. The ridge trail was more difficult than I expected. Parts of it had eroded away completely, forcing me to inch along narrow ledges with a sheer drop just a foot away. My legs were strong, but the weight of my pack made every step feel more dangerous. One wrong move and that would be it. Still, the views were worth it. I saw both valleys stretching far below, thick with trees and untouched wilderness. Not a building or road in sight. Felt like stepping back in time. Around noon, the trail split unexpectedly. There was no mention of this fork in the blog, and it wasn't marked on my map either. The left side seemed to follow the ridge. The right dipped downward slightly into a thicker patch of forest. I hesitated for a while, trying to match what I saw to the topographic lines on my map, but nothing lined up clearly. I decided to stay left. The ridge had been my goal from the beginning. The forest could wait. That was the choice that changed everything. The ridge narrowed even more. Soon it was barely a trail, just a faint depression in the rock and loose dirt, snaking along the spine of the mountain. I slowed my pace, checking my footing every step. The wind picked up too, not strong enough to knock me over, but strong enough to make me feel unsteady. By mid-afternoon, I realized something wasn't right. I should have reached the high point by then, the place where the blog said the view stretched for miles in all directions. But I hadn't seen anything like that yet. Just more rock, more scrubby trees clinging to the cliffside. The air started to feel different too, colder, even though the sun was still out. A bad feeling crept in. It wasn't panic yet, just a sense that I had somehow gone off route. I tried to retrace my steps, but the trail was so faint by now that I couldn't be sure where it had gone. I checked my GPS, but the trail hadn't been mapped on it to begin with, and the position bounced around too much on the rocky terrain to be helpful. So I kept moving forward. That was my second mistake. By early evening, clouds started rolling in, fast, thick and gray, like smoke spilling over the ridge. The air dropped another 5 degrees in what felt like minutes. I checked my phone, no signal of course, and then looked at my map again. None of it made sense anymore. The features didn't line up. I wasn't where I thought I was. Maybe I'd followed a game trail. Maybe the ridge forked again and I hadn't noticed. I don't know. I made the call to camp right there before things got worse. I found a narrow, flat spot tucked behind a few boulders and set up my tent in a rush. By the time I got inside, it had started to rain. That night, I didn't sleep well. The wind never stopped. It howled across the ridge, making the tent shake and snap. Around midnight, something heavy thudded against the side of the tent. I froze. I thought it was a bear, or maybe a falling rock. I didn't make a sound. I waited, holding my breath for what felt like hours. Nothing else happened. In the morning, I stepped outside and saw that a piece of tree branch, thick and heavy, had broken off and landed right beside me. A few feet to the left and it would have crushed the tent. My stomach turned at the thought. I packed up and decided to head back, but that was easier said than done. Everything looked different in the fog and rain. The trail was gone, wiped clean. I tried to use the compass, but without clear landmarks, it wasn't much help. I started walking downhill, figuring I'd eventually hit the forest I saw earlier and maybe find the lower trail from the fork. I didn't. What I found was worse. I descended into a steep, rocky slope that turned into thick brush. No trail, no sign of people, just loose ground and thorny plants that tore at my clothes and pack. I slipped several times, catching myself on trees or rocks. Once, I fell hard and felt a jolt in my wrist. It wasn't broken, but it hurt like hell. I wrapped it with a compression bandage from my first aid kit. By that afternoon, I was out of the alpine zone and deep in dense forest. Everything was wet and dark. The trees grew close together, blocking the sun. I stopped to rest and eat. I checked my GPS again. It still showed my position bouncing all over the place. I couldn't even tell which way was north without pulling out the compass again, and the cloud cover made the light direction useless. I thought about turning around, but I didn't know which direction back was anymore. I was completely disoriented. That night, I slept in the forest. No tent, just a tarp tied between 2 trees. The ground was uneven and damp. I didn't bother cooking. I ate trail mix in silence, swatting at bugs, listening to distant sounds I couldn't place. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. I didn't see anything, but I kept the bear spray in my hand all night. The third day, I tried following a creek I stumbled upon. Water usually leads somewhere. I hoped it would take me down to a river, maybe even a logging road. But the terrain got worse. The creek dropped into a steep ravine, and I had to slide down on my side, grabbing tree roots and rocks. I lost my footing once and tumbled 6 or 7 feet into cold water. My pack hit first, then my back. I lay there for a while, dazed, staring up at the canopy. Everything hurt. I crawled out and checked myself. No serious injuries, just cuts, bruises, and a growing sense of dread. That night was the worst. I found a flat area near the creek and tried to dry off, but my gear was soaked. I curled up in my sleeping bag, damp and cold, and listened again. The forest felt alive in a different way. I kept hearing something moving around me, not close, but not far either. I couldn't explain it, just the feeling of not being alone anymore. I gripped the bear spray so hard my hand cramped. I didn't sleep, not really. By the 4th morning, I knew I was in trouble. I had 2 days of food left. My water purifier still worked, but I could tell I was getting weaker. I twisted my ankle slightly in the fall, and every step now made me wince. I started yelling, hoping someone might hear me. I went hiking alone last fall in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. It was the first week of October, and the air had just started to feel colder. The mornings were crisp and foggy, the kind where your breath looks like smoke and everything smells like wet pine. I had been planning the trip for a couple months. I had a long weekend off work, and I wanted to spend it out in the woods, away from people, phones, and traffic. I packed everything I thought I would need: tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, water, first aid kit, map, compass, knife, headlamp, and extra batteries. I even brought bear spray, though I had never needed it before. I wasn't worried. The trail I picked wasn't one of the popular ones. It was about 30 miles round trip, with some steep inclines and narrow switchbacks. Most people preferred the lake trails closer to town, but I didn't want that. I wanted silence. I parked my truck at the trailhead just after sunrise on Friday morning. There was only one other car in the lot, an old Subaru that looked like it hadn't moved in a few days. That should have been a red flag. I remember thinking someone was probably already deep into their own backpacking trip. I adjusted the straps of my pack and started hiking. The trail started out wide and well-marked. I made good time the first few hours. Birds were chirping. The sunlight filtered through tall pines and lit up the orange and yellow leaves on the ground. Felt perfect. After about 10 miles, I reached a narrow ridge. The trees thinned out, and I could see miles of rolling forest in every direction. I stopped there to eat lunch. I sat on a rock, took off my boots, and let my feet breathe. That was the last time I felt truly relaxed. When I started hiking again, I came to a fork in the trail that wasn't on my map. The main trail continued downhill to the left. The right fork looked older, less maintained, and the marker sign was cracked and unreadable. I remember stopping there for a long time trying to decide. The map didn't show anything on the right path, but something about it looked interesting, like it hadn't been used in years. I figured it might be a shortcut to the upper ridge I was heading toward, or an old trail that was left off newer maps. I decided to take it. That decision changed everything. The first half mile was quiet, too quiet. I didn't hear any birds anymore, just the crunch of dead leaves under my boots and the sound of my breathing. The trail climbed steeply and then dipped into a narrow ravine. There were old fallen logs and thick patches of bramble. At first I told myself it would rejoin the main trail soon. I checked the compass, and I was still heading in the general direction I wanted to go. But after another hour, things didn't feel right anymore. The path narrowed so much that it barely looked like a trail. The trees were packed tighter, and everything smelled damp and sour. There were no signs, no markers, no boot prints. I saw a couple of old rusted cans by a rock and what looked like a piece of torn flannel stuck on a branch. It was so faded I almost missed it. I kept walking, thinking maybe I'd run into an old campsite or logging road. I didn't want to backtrack. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, I knew I was lost. I set up camp on a flat spot beside a small stream. I filtered water, cooked some dehydrated food, and tried to convince myself I'd find the main trail in the morning. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things outside the tent. Small sounds at first, twigs snapping, dry leaves shifting. Then once, around 2 a.m., something bigger. Heavy footsteps, maybe 20 feet away. I held my breath. I didn't have the courage to unzip the tent and look. I gripped the bear spray and kept staring at the ceiling of the tent until the sky started to lighten. The next morning, I packed up fast. I left the spot cleaner than I found it and hiked in the direction I thought the trail should be. But nothing looked familiar. I wasn't climbing anymore. I was heading downhill into thicker woods. The terrain got muddy and soft. My boots sank a little with each step. I started to see strange things like bones. Animal bones, I hoped. A small skull, maybe a fox or raccoon, lying beside a moss-covered log. A rib cage, clean and picked dry, tangled in roots. Something felt very wrong in that area. I kept going. By mid-afternoon, it started to drizzle. The rain was cold and made everything slick. I slipped twice, once hard enough to bruise my hip. My pack got soaked. I pulled the rain cover over it, but my gear was already damp. I still hadn't seen a trail marker or any sign of people. The only human thing I came across was a pile of stacked stones near a tree. It didn't look natural, and it wasn't there by chance. Someone had placed them, carefully, like a marker or maybe a warning. I hiked past it. Another mile or so down, I found a clearing. There was a rusted-out camper trailer in the center of it, half sunken into the ground. Trees had grown up around it. The door was hanging off the hinges. Part of me wanted to look inside. Part of me didn't. I walked around it once. There were no signs of anyone. No footprints. No gear. Just old empty cans and broken glass. The windows were smashed in. Inside, I saw a broken chair, a shredded tarp, and some animal droppings. Nothing useful. I didn't want to sleep near it, so I kept going another hour. It was nearly dark when I found a spot that wasn't muddy. I set up my tent again. That night, the footsteps came back. Slower this time. Heavier. Closer. I was sure they stopped right beside my tent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Whatever it was stood there for what felt like forever. Then I heard it walk away. In the morning, I saw the prints. They weren't boots. They weren't paws either. They looked like bare feet. Human feet. But not quite. The toes were long. Too long. I couldn't explain them. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe the rain messed them up. Maybe it was just a deer and the print got warped in the mud. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I started hiking again without eating breakfast. I was exhausted. I had barely slept in 2 days. My hands were shaking. My legs were sore. But I didn't want to stay another night in those woods. I checked the compass again and tried to keep heading northeast. I thought that would eventually bring me back toward the original trail. But I ended up in another ravine. The slope was steep and full of loose rock. I had to climb down using my hands. At the bottom, I found a dry creek bed and followed it. I thought it might lead to a road or river. But after another mile, the brush got so thick I had to crawl through it. That's when I found the shoes. 2 of them. Hiking boots. Old and torn. One of them still had a sock in it. The sock was stained dark brown. I didn't look too closely. I picked up my pace. I felt like I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I kept turning around, but I never saw anyone. Just the trees. The silence was heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. That night, I didn't even set up the tent. I crawled under a rocky overhang, wrapped myself in the sleeping bag, and kept the knife in one hand. I didn't sleep. I just laid there with my eyes open, waiting for the night to end. Every sound felt too close. A branch breaking, leaves rustling. At one point, I saw a figure move between the trees. I couldn't make out what it was. It didn't look like an animal. It moved too smoothly. I stayed under the rocks until the sky turned gray. By the 4th day, I was completely disoriented. My food was nearly gone. My water filter was clogged with dirt. My lips were dry and cracked. I was lightheaded. I kept moving, but slower now. I had no idea where I was. Around noon, I heard a noise that didn't come from the forest. It was a motor. I ran toward it, tripping over branches and rocks. I cut my leg, tore my jacket. But I didn't stop. After a few minutes, I stumbled onto a dirt road. It was narrow and overgrown, but real. I followed it. After what felt like hours, I saw a cabin. It was old and boarded up, but there was a pickup truck parked beside it. I walked right up to it and collapsed on the steps. The owner found me there an hour later. He was an older man, maybe in his 60s. He didn't say much, just gave me water and let me sit inside while he called the county ranger on his radio. I told them I was lost, that I had taken a wrong turn. I didn't mention the footsteps or the trailer or the prints. I just said I was off the trail for 3 days. They took me to a clinic the next morning. I had dehydration, a mild concussion, and a few deep scratches on my arms and legs. I stayed there overnight. Then I went home. I never went back to that trail. I checked the area on newer maps. That fork I took doesn't exist. Not officially. I've looked for it online too. No one seems to know about it. Or maybe they just don't talk about it. Every once in a while, I'll think about going back, just to see it again. But then I remember the prints, the silence, the feeling that something was out there, just out of sight, watching. I had done solo hikes before, usually half-day trips in familiar places. But this time, I wanted something longer, deeper, a trail where I wouldn't run into crowds or hear traffic in the distance. I had 3 days off and found a lesser-known loop in the northern part of the state, a 22-mile circuit through thick forest and steep ridgelines, not far from a town called Kepler. I looked up the trailhead, read a few vague reviews, and packed up my gear. The drive out took nearly 6 hours. Most of the last stretch was on gravel roads with deep washouts and no signs. I passed only 2 cars the entire time. One was parked at a hunter's pull-off, the other just rusting away in the trees. When I finally reached the tiny dirt lot at the trailhead, there was no one else around. No other cars. Just a faded board nailed to 2 posts showing a rough sketch of the loop. I took a picture of it with my phone, just in case. There was no cell signal, of course. It was already past noon when I started walking. The first few miles felt fine. The trail wasn't marked with blazes, but it was cut wide enough that I could follow it. Just a steady climb up through old pine and oak trees, with only the sound of wind and distant birds. I didn't bring headphones. I like to hear everything out there. Leaves crunching under my boots, the shifting weight of my pack, distant rustles from squirrels or deer. That silence was part of the reason I went hiking in the first place. I hiked until a little past 5, then found a flat spot near a bend in the trail to pitch my tent. I had brought a small one-person setup, a lightweight sleeping bag, and just enough food for 3 days if I rationed carefully. I ate a protein bar, boiled some noodles, and filtered water from a nearby creek. I watched the sun dip behind the ridges through the trees. The sky was so clear that I could see the pink tint fade into deep blue. I zipped into my sleeping bag just as the chill set in. That first night was calm. Just the usual night sounds. Crickets, wind, the occasional crack of a branch far off. I woke up a few times to adjust, but I wasn't scared. I'd slept alone in the woods plenty of times before. The next morning, I packed up early. My goal was to cover at least 10 miles so I could finish the loop by the 3rd day without rushing. The trail climbed steeply for a while, then dropped into a narrow gorge filled with slick rocks and fallen logs. I had to slow down there. I twisted my ankle once but caught myself. After about 4 miles, I came to a split. That's where things started to go wrong. There was no sign at the junction. Just 2 paths, one to the right and one slightly uphill to the left. I pulled out my phone and looked at the photo I'd taken of the trail map, but it didn't show that junction. I chose the left path. It looked more worn. That was my mistake. At first, it still felt like a proper trail. It was narrow but clearly traveled. I passed a few old fire rings, some overgrown. That gave me confidence. I hiked for about 2 more hours, stopping once to refill water. But the farther I went, the fainter the path became. The trees grew thicker. Thorns snagged at my sleeves. At some point, I stopped and really looked around. I hadn't seen a trail marker in hours. Not that there were many to begin with. Then I realized something worse. I hadn't seen any human footprints either. Just deer tracks. No boot prints. No cut logs or man-made signs. Just wilderness. I kept walking for another half hour, trying to see if the trail would reconnect. But the more I pushed forward, the more it felt wrong. My gut told me I was off course. I turned around, retraced my steps, and tried to find the fork again. I walked for maybe 20 minutes, but nothing looked familiar. The brush felt different. There was a bend I didn't recognize, a small creek that hadn't been there earlier. Everything blurred together. That's when the panic started to creep in. I wasn't terrified yet, but something in me tightened. I felt it in my chest. I slowed down. I tried to think clearly. I had food, water. My phone's GPS didn't work, but I had a compass, and I remembered which general direction the trailhead had been in southwest. I decided to follow my compass. I figured I'd eventually hit the main loop again if I just kept moving in that direction. But nothing is straight in the woods. The land curved up and down, with rocky gullies and dense undergrowth that forced me to zigzag constantly. Every few minutes, I had to step over rotting logs or fight through thick ferns. I stopped often to check my bearings. After 2 more hours, I realized I was circling. I came across the same patch of deadfall twice. I knew it because one of the logs had a weird chunk of orange fungus on it. That was when I admitted I was lost. The light was fading fast, and the temperature was already dropping. I didn't want to risk stumbling around in the dark, so I looked for the flattest ground I could find and set up my tent again. I boiled water quickly, ate a freeze-dried meal, and wrapped myself in all the layers I had. But I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound outside the tent made me flinch. Not because of animals. I knew what animals sounded like. It was the fact that I didn't know where I was anymore. I could have been 10 miles off the trail, or 50. No one knew where I was. I tried to calm myself down by thinking in steps. In the morning, I'd climb the highest ridge I could find and look for landmarks. A road, clearing, anything. That plan worked for a while. I packed up at sunrise, headed uphill, and climbed until I reached a narrow ridgeline that let me see above the trees. The view should have been beautiful, but all I felt was dread. Forest in every direction. No houses, no towers, no signs of people, just miles and miles of green. I picked the farthest ridge in the distance that looked a little lighter, maybe a field or open land, and started walking that way. I rationed food more carefully, just a granola bar and a few sips of water at a time. I knew if I didn't find my way out soon, I'd run out. I kept moving for hours. I slipped and cut my hand once on a sharp rock. It bled a lot more than I expected, and I used part of my shirt to wrap it. The wound stung every time I moved my fingers. By midday, I was drained. My legs ached. My lips were cracked. I hadn't seen anything useful, just more trees, more brush, more dead ends. Then I found the boot. It was lying on its side near the base of a tree, partly buried in leaves. A single old hiking boot, faded black, cracked at the seams. It was covered in dirt and green mold, but it wasn't rotten. It hadn't been there for decades. Someone had lost it, or left it. I looked around, but there was no pack, no signs of a camp, no bones. Just that one boot. I kept going faster now. My mind wouldn't let go of the thought. Someone else got lost here too, and maybe they didn't get out. That night, I barely managed to pitch my tent. I didn't even eat. I just curled up in my bag and stared at the ceiling of the nylon, listening. I was too tired to be scared anymore, just numb. On the 4th day, I almost stepped on a rattlesnake. It was coiled near a patch of sunlit rocks, not moving much. I must have startled it. It rattled once, loud and sharp, and I jumped back so fast I nearly fell. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I sat down on a nearby log and just breathed. I knew if I got bitten out here, I wouldn't make it. That was the moment I started yelling. Not screaming, just calling out, hoping someone would hear me. A hunter, a ranger, anyone. But my voice vanished into the trees like mist. I kept hiking. I lost track of time after that. I think it was late on the 5th day when I found the remnants of an old fence. Just rusted wire and a few rotting posts. But it was man-made. That meant something. I followed it for nearly an hour. Eventually, it led me to a dirt road. Barely a road at all, just 2 ruts in the grass, but it was wide enough for a truck. I laughed when I saw it. Actually laughed out loud. I turned and walked along that road, my feet aching with every step. I didn't know where it led, but it was better than wandering blind. After maybe 3 miles, I saw a gate, then a mailbox, then a house, old, run-down, empty. But behind it, there was a real gravel road, one with tire tracks. I followed it until I found a cabin with smoke coming out of the chimney. They had a landline. Help came a few hours later. A local volunteer rescue guy drove me back into town. I didn't ask questions. I just took the bottle of water he handed me and drank the whole thing without stopping. I lost 12 pounds in 6 days. My hand got infected and needed antibiotics. I had deep scrapes on both legs and 2 ticks buried in my skin. But I got out. Now I stick to marked trails. I tell people exactly where I'm going. I carry a GPS beacon. And I never, ever follow a path just because it looks like a trail. Because that's how people vanish out there. Not all at once. Just one wrong turn and then another, and then you're in a place where even the animals don't bother going. I was lucky, but I know now I was never as alone. I didn't really plan the hike the way I should have. I just wanted a break. Work had been draining me, and city noise never stopped even at night. I needed real quiet, not the kind you get with headphones on or in your apartment with the windows shut. I wanted silence that stretched for miles, the kind of silence you feel pressing against your skin. So I took a week off and picked a trail I'd never done before. One deep in a national forest I hadn't explored. It was called Signal Ridge Trail. Not the most original name. I didn't know much about it, only that it was long, had a lot of climbs, and almost no reception once you got past the halfway mark. I packed 5 days worth of food, a good sleeping bag, a small tent, and my usual hiking gear. I kept my phone charged and brought a power bank, but I already expected I wouldn't be using it much once I got deep in. That was part of the point. I parked my car at a small dirt lot next to the trailhead early on a Monday morning. There was only one other car there. The fog was thick, but I was used to early morning moisture. I locked up, stretched my legs, and started walking. The first few miles were calm. I passed through a dense line of tall trees that blocked the sky. Sunlight filtered through in pieces like broken glass. The path twisted upward, but nothing too steep yet. I saw squirrels darting around and heard birds overhead. But no people, no hikers. It was perfect. By the afternoon, I was 5 or 6 miles in. I passed a wooden sign with faded letters that said, "Beyond here, limited access. Weather may obscure trail." I stopped and drank water. I noticed there were no new footprints in the dirt past that sign. The trail ahead looked tighter and more wild. Still, I wasn't worried. I had a compass, GPS, paper map, extra batteries, everything I needed. The temperature dropped as the trees closed in tighter. I walked slower, partly from the cold and partly because the trail was harder to follow. Rocks and roots cut across it in all directions. I slipped a couple of times but caught myself. I kept checking the map and compass every hour, making sure I was still heading in the right direction. By the time I made camp that night, I had covered about 10 miles. I found a flat patch near a small clearing and set up my tent. I boiled some freeze-dried food, stretched out on my mat, and fell asleep fast. The next morning, things still felt fine. I kept going, passing over a ridge with a beautiful view of the valley below. The fog was mostly gone now, and I could see for miles. But the trail on the other side of the ridge was rough. It didn't look like anyone had maintained it in years. I followed what I could, but by midday the path faded. I stopped and took out my map again. It showed a thin line cutting across the ridge and down into a hollow. That was where I needed to go. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I realized I hadn't seen any signs or trail markers in hours. I looked around. Everything was too quiet. I stood still for a while, trying to hear anything. There were no birds, no wind, just my own breathing. I checked the GPS, but the signal was gone. I tried my phone. Nothing. I turned to head back and realized something that hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know which way was back. I had made so many turns, cut through some brush, and drifted off the original trail without even realizing it. I hadn't left markers because I assumed I was still on a path. I started walking in what I thought was the right direction. I tried to stay calm, using my compass and trying to get back to where I had camped the night before. But the forest didn't look the same. Everything was slightly off, like I had stepped into a copy of the woods I had just passed through, but made by someone who didn't know the details. I kept going for hours. I didn't find the camp. That night, I set up my tent again. It was colder. I barely ate. I stayed awake for a long time, listening to the forest. There was still no wind, no birds. It wasn't just silent. It felt heavy, like something in the woods didn't want me there anymore. The third day, I climbed a small rise, hoping to get a better view. I saw trees stretching in every direction. No trail, no breaks in the canopy, nothing. The map didn't help anymore. I marked my position with a red cloth tied to a branch and tried to pick a direction to follow. The compass needle spun slowly, then stopped, pointing north. I followed it. The forest kept changing. It wasn't anything supernatural, just small changes that added up. The ground got softer like peat. There were more fallen logs, then more steep slopes. I crossed a dry creek bed around noon and slipped hard, scraping my leg. I kept walking, bleeding just a little, but enough to make me limp. By the time the sun set, I was exhausted. I hadn't eaten much that day, just a protein bar and half a bottle of water. I rationed the rest. I was 4 days from my car and now had no idea if I was even within 20 miles of it. I tried to build a small fire, but the wood was damp. I shivered most of the night. Day 4 felt like I was in a loop. I passed a patch of mushrooms that looked familiar. Then a large dead tree I swore I had already seen. But I kept walking, thinking maybe I was going in circles. I marked trees now, carving small slashes in the bark. But even that didn't help. I'd find marks where I didn't expect them. Once I found one of my own red cloth markers on a branch I hadn't seen since the morning before, even though I had walked the opposite direction. I started yelling, not calling for help, just out of frustration. It didn't echo. The sound fell flat. I kept walking until I found a small pond, murky and dark. I filled my bottle and used the filter pump I carried to make it drinkable. The water tasted like dirt. That night, I didn't set up the tent. I just wrapped myself in the sleeping bag and lay near the base of a tree. I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing movement, not loud, just leaves crunching slowly, twigs snapping far off, then closer. I told myself it was animals, probably deer, maybe a fox, but the steps came in pairs like human feet, and they always stopped when I sat up. By the 5th morning, I knew I wasn't just lost. I was far past lost. I had stopped recognizing the terrain entirely. Everything looked older, wetter, darker. The trees grew too close together. Branches clawed at me as I pushed through. I stopped using the map. I stopped using the compass. I just walked. I hadn't eaten in almost a full day. My food was gone. My stomach felt like it was folding in on itself. I drank water from the pond again. I knew it would make me sick if I kept doing it, but I had no choice. Midday, I saw something that made my chest tighten. A glove. A single brown glove on the ground, half buried in wet leaves. It looked old, cracked leather. I picked it up. No name inside, no trail around it, just a glove. Then a few hours later, I saw a plastic wrapper. An old granola bar wrapper, faded and shredded at the edges. That scared me more than the glove. It meant someone else had been here, and they had either made it out, or they hadn't. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat with my back to a tree, gripping a small pocket knife I had never used until then. Something moved near me around 2 a.m. I heard something sniffing, slow steps in the dirt, then silence. My heart thudded so hard I thought I'd pass out. I didn't move until daylight. The 6th day, I couldn't walk straight anymore. My legs shook, and every few steps I tripped. I was weak, hungry, and starting to feel hot even though the air was cold. Fever, probably from the water. My lips were dry and split. My fingers shook when I tried to tie my boots. Then, in the afternoon, I heard a sound that didn't belong. A hum, faint at first, then stronger. It was a generator. I followed it, pushing through underbrush that tore at my clothes. I nearly collapsed when I saw it. A metal shack, not a house, just a single-room shelter with a solar panel and a small antenna on the roof. I stumbled toward it. The door was locked, but the window was open an inch. I pried it wider and climbed in. Inside, the air was dry. I found a radio, the kind used for shortwave communication. There were canned goods in a plastic bin. I ate 2 without even checking the labels. I drank from a jug in the corner. I tried the radio. First, nothing but static. Then, finally, a voice. Faint, distant, but real. I pressed the button and gave my name. Said I was lost. gave what I thought were my coordinates. I stayed in that shack for 2 nights. On the morning of the 3rd day, I heard a helicopter. I ran outside, waving a piece of my red cloth like a flag. It circled once, then lowered enough for someone to point and wave. They found me. Later, in the hospital, they told me I had been gone 8 days. I had dropped over 20 pounds. I was dehydrated, feverish, and covered in cuts. The rangers asked where I had gone, and I showed them on the map where I thought I had been. They looked confused. They said no trail ran that far east. The shack I found wasn't even listed. I've always enjoyed hiking alone. There's something peaceful about being deep in the woods with nothing but your own breath and footsteps. Calms my head. I don't do it to find myself or to feel closer to nature or anything like that. I just like being away from the constant noise and rush of the city. I usually plan out my hikes carefully, checking weather, maps, and terrain, and packing just enough to stay light but prepared. In late September last year, I took a week off work and headed into the Southern Rockies in Colorado. I wanted to try a less trafficked area called West Minor Ridge. Not many people go there because the trails aren't well maintained, but that's what drew me in. The plan was to hike in about 15 miles, set up camp by a remote lake I saw on the map, then loop back over 2 days. I had a printed topographic map, a GPS watch, and a compass just in case. I wasn't some newbie out for a stroll. I had done solo hikes before. Nothing had ever gone seriously wrong. That changed fast. I started early that Monday morning. The first few miles were pleasant, even though the trail was barely visible in spots. The trees were already turning, and the air smelled like dry pine needles. The ground was soft underfoot, scattered with patches of gold and orange leaves. It was silent except for the wind moving through the branches. Around mile 6, I crossed an old wooden bridge that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Boards were cracked and warped, and underneath I could hear the soft rush of a shallow stream. On the other side, the trail thinned out and became a faint line through dense brush. I followed it anyway, checking my location every hour or so against the map. By late afternoon, I was deep into the ridge. I hadn't seen a single person all day. I liked that. I reached a small clearing on a bluff that overlooked a narrow valley. The lake I was aiming for was still a few miles ahead, but I wanted to take a break and eat. I dropped my pack, pulled out a granola bar, and sat with my back against a log. Everything felt calm. That was the last time I felt relaxed on that trip. When I got up to keep going, I noticed something was off. My compass needle was acting strange, jerking slightly, not settling properly. I tapped it and turned in place. The needle swung like it should have, but kept shifting back and forth a few degrees. I figured it might be some nearby iron deposit or interference. I trusted my map and GPS watch more anyway. So I kept walking, thinking nothing of it. But about 30 minutes later, the trail faded out completely. Not in a slow way where it becomes faint. This was like someone had cut it off with a knife. 1 minute it was there, the next it was just grass and scattered pine cones. I stood in place for a while, scanning the ground. I backtracked, thinking maybe I'd taken a wrong turn, but I hadn't. I checked the map and my GPS, and both said I was still on the trail or where it should have been. That's when I noticed the sun had dipped low. The light filtering through the trees had that heavy yellow-orange look. Shadows stretched long across the ground. I hadn't reached the lake, and now the trail was gone. I had to make a choice. Either set up camp right there and try to find the path again in the morning, or keep pushing forward through unmarked forest. I chose to set up camp. I wasn't that far from where the lake should have been. I figured I could find it in the morning and get back on track. I cleared a flat spot between 2 trees, laid out my tent, and boiled water for my dehydrated meal. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. By nightfall, it was in the low 40s. I remember sitting in my tent, headlamp on, reading the map again. According to the elevation lines, I wasn't far from the lake. It had to be a few hundred feet east, downhill. But I decided to wait until morning when I'd have light. I went to sleep thinking it'd all be fine tomorrow. It wasn't. That night I woke up suddenly. No sound. Just that odd feeling you get when something snaps you awake even though nothing seems wrong. I sat up, listening. My breath fogged in the cold air. There was no wind, no bugs, nothing. Just total silence and a pressure in my gut like I'd left the stove on back home. I stayed still for a long time, then finally laid back down. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I packed up early. The trees looked different in the daylight, more crowded like they'd shifted overnight. I pushed east trying to find the lake. After 20 minutes, all I found was dense brush and fallen logs. No water, no trail. I climbed up a small ridge and looked out. The terrain didn't match the map, not even close. I checked my GPS. It said I was where I should have been. The map showed a slope down to the lake, but what I saw was a drop-off. A steep, rocky descent full of dead trees. I stood there, confused. Something wasn't lining up. I tried hiking back the way I'd come, but after an hour, nothing looked familiar. The sun was still low, but I could tell it was moving west, and that meant I was going east again, not back. I turned around and started walking in the opposite direction. By mid-afternoon, I was completely disoriented. My compass was still jittery. My GPS started freezing up. I changed the batteries. It didn't help. The trails were gone. Everything looked the same. Tall pine trees, fallen branches, moss-covered rocks. I couldn't tell if I was going in circles or deeper into some part of the forest I'd never seen. Then I found something. I was climbing over a patch of rocky terrain when I saw an old tarp, half buried under leaves. It was shredded, faded green, and covered in mildew. Nearby was the rusted frame of what looked like a pack. The fabric was mostly gone. A cracked water bottle lay in the dirt, yellowed and brittle. There were no signs of animals or people, just old gear left to rot. Seeing that shook me a bit. It meant someone else had been here and hadn't made it out. I didn't stop, couldn't. I didn't want the sun to set before I found a way out. But the terrain just kept getting worse. Dense clusters of trees blocked my path. I had to climb over fallen logs, crawl under branches, and scramble up loose rock. I stopped only to drink and check the map again, even though by now I barely trusted it. By early evening, I reached a small ridge and saw something ahead, a faint trail, just a line through the trees, barely visible, but it was something. I followed it. It led to an old fire ring made of stones. There were ashes inside, but old, gray, and cold. No tent, no gear, just signs someone had camped here once, maybe years ago. I stayed there that night. I didn't want to move anymore. I was too tired. My hands were scraped from grabbing rock. My legs ached. I felt dehydrated even though I'd been sipping water. I set up camp and watched the sky turn purple and then black. No stars that night, just thick clouds rolling in. I woke up to rain around 2 a.m. It wasn't hard, but steady, enough to soak everything. I pulled my rainfly tight and waited it out. By morning, the forest was drenched. Everything smelled like wet bark and dirt. I packed up and followed the faint trail again, hoping it'd lead out. But the trail didn't go anywhere. It stopped after a few hundred feet and dropped into a gully choked with underbrush. I tried to bushwhack through it, but I slipped on wet rock and cut my hand on something sharp sticking out of the dirt. When I looked down, I realized it was a broken hunting knife. The handle was cracked. Half the blade was gone. Another sign someone had been here and left something behind. I bandaged my hand, which was bleeding more than I liked, and kept moving. But now I had a nagging feeling in my chest that kept growing. Kind of dread. Not fear, not yet. Just unease. Like I was walking into something I couldn't see. That afternoon, I made a mistake. I tried to climb a rock face to get better visibility. It wasn't huge, maybe 30 feet high, but the rain had made it slick. I slipped near the top, fell about 8 feet, and landed badly. My ankle rolled under me. Pain shot up my leg. I sat there for a long time, trying not to panic. The ankle wasn't broken, but it was swelling fast. I limped back into the trees and made a makeshift crutch from a branch. Moving was slow now. Every step felt like fire under my knee. I had to rest every 10 minutes. That night, I didn't sleep much. It was cold. I was hungry, My last proper meal was nearly 2 days ago. I had trail mix and a few energy bars left, but I was burning through them fast. The next day, I heard something strange. It was around noon. I was limping through a narrow valley, trying to follow a dry streambed, when I heard a low humming sound. Not mechanical, more like a distant hum in the air. Came and went. I stood still, listening, but I couldn't place it. I thought maybe it was in my head. I moved on, but the sound came back later that afternoon, same tone, same rhythm. I stopped again. Stopped too. I started to wonder if I was hallucinating. I hadn't seen another person in days. My ankle was worse. My water was low. I couldn't even tell which way was north anymore. That night, I was looking for a break, not just from work, but from everything. From the noise, the traffic, the way my phone never stopped buzzing, and the way the same walls stared at me every night. I had been sitting at a desk for too long, weeks blending into each other, my back stiffening, eyes burning from screens. I hadn't taken a vacation in almost a year. My sleep was trash. I was short-tempered. My body felt heavier than it should. So I told myself I needed nature. Not a touristy day hike or a national park with hot dog stands and kids on scooters. I needed something far from people. Somewhere I could feel silence in my bones, where the wind in the trees would be louder than engines, and the ground would be real dirt, not paved walkways. I picked a trail out in the backcountry of Idaho, not a popular one. It didn't have online reviews or Instagram tags. I found it through an old hiking forum. Someone had posted about it 4 years ago and described it as isolated, rough, and peaceful. That's exactly what I was looking for. The place was called Birch Hollow Trail, though I didn't see any birch trees in the photos. The trail was supposed to wind about 18 miles into a forested valley surrounded by mountains. No cell service, no roads once you got past the ranger's post about 2 miles in. The person in the forum post said you could set up camp by a creek that ran cold all year, and that you wouldn't see another soul for days if you were lucky. I packed carefully. I've done hikes before. I wasn't a total amateur. I had my tent, my sleeping bag, first aid, satellite GPS, emergency beacon, bear spray, extra batteries, food for 5 days, and a water filter. I also had my old field journal and a book I never finished. I even brought a small hand axe in case I needed to clear brush or chop firewood. I wasn't reckless, I just needed silence. The first day started smooth. The gravel road out to the trailhead was rough, and I had to park my car under a crooked pine tree off the side, then walk the rest of the way up to the trailhead. I signed in at the dusty old trail register nailed to a post. There were only 2 other entries in the past month. That gave me a weird feeling in my gut, but I ignored it. This was what I wanted, no people, no distractions. The first few miles were peaceful. The trail was rough, overgrown in places, but still clear enough to follow. I kept my GPS in my front pocket and checked my compass from time to time. The forest felt untouched. No wrappers, no weird stacks of rocks, no graffiti, just moss, trees, birds, and the crunch of my boots. Around mile 6, the elevation started changing fast. The trail climbed up the side of a ridge. The trees thinned out, the wind picked up, and the ground turned to loose rock. I slowed down. My thighs burned from the incline. I took long breaks and drank water. At one point, I sat on a flat rock overlooking the valley I came from and just listened. No cars, no dogs barking, no planes, just the whistle of wind and the creak of trees shifting. I felt like I had dropped off the map, and it felt right. I pushed a few more miles and made camp around mile 10. I picked a flat patch near a small stream that forked off a larger creek. The trees there were tall and old, with thick roots that rose up out of the dirt. It smelled like pine needles and cold earth. I boiled water, ate a dry freeze meal, and stretched out by the fire. I could feel the stress bleeding out of my body. That night was quiet. I slept well, better than I had in weeks. Day 2 started colder than I expected. My breath fogged up in front of me when I crawled out of the tent. I boiled water for coffee and took my time packing. I planned to hike another 5 or 6 miles deeper in and then spend the rest of the trip exploring side trails or reading by the creek. Around mile 13, the trail faded. Not completely, but enough to notice. The dirt path narrowed, and thorny brush started closing in on both sides. It looked like no one had walked that part in a long time. I checked my GPS, still on track, but there was a sense of distance now that felt different, like I had stepped outside the world a little. I kept going. The brush got worse, and the incline started again. At one point, I had to climb over a fallen tree that looked like it had been there for years. Its bark was gone, its wood pale and dry. I stepped on it carefully and jumped down the other side. That's when I noticed something strange. On the ground were deep scratches in the dirt. 3 lines, not like from claws but like from metal. They were old, faint, almost washed away by weather and time. They didn't match anything else around, and there weren't any signs or fences nearby. I stared at them for a while and then moved on. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing. That's where I planned to camp. It was surrounded by trees but open in the center, with a small rock fire ring someone had built long ago. A rotting log sat nearby, perfect for sitting. I set up my tent and filtered more water. The air was crisp, and there were small white mushrooms growing around the edge of the trees. I sat by the fire that night and stared at the flames for hours. I should have felt calm, but I didn't. Something was off. Maybe it was just the total silence. Maybe I had been around people for too long, but the quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy. I went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. All night I kept thinking I heard twigs snapping. Not loud, just little pops, like someone stepping lightly. Every time I sat up and looked outside the tent, there was nothing. Just the fire burning low and the trees swaying gently. By morning, I was exhausted. I felt hungover even though I hadn't had a drink in weeks. My head throbbed. My back was sore. I rubbed my eyes and made coffee again, trying to shake it off. That day, I planned to do some light hiking without my pack, just explore the area. There was a steep hill not far from camp that looked like it might have a good view from the top. I grabbed my day bag, stuffed in some food and water, and headed out. About halfway up the hill, I found another strange thing. More scratches, deeper this time on a flat slab of stone. 3 long, curved grooves that looked carved. They were spaced far apart, maybe 3 feet between each. I leaned over them, ran my hand along the grooves. They were too deep for weathering. Maybe it was from machinery, but this deep in the woods? It bugged me. I kept going up the hill and found a small plateau at the top. The view was incredible. Endless forest and distant peaks. I sat there and ate, but I couldn't enjoy it. I kept thinking about those grooves. They weren't natural. They couldn't be. When I got back to camp that afternoon, I found something that made my stomach turn. One of my tent stakes had been pulled out. Just one. The corner of the tent was flapping gently in the breeze. At first I thought maybe it was wind, but the stake wasn't far. It was lying next to the tent, clean, no dirt on it, like someone had pulled it out and set it down. I stood there, not moving, just staring at it. The rest of the camp looked untouched. Food bag was still tied up in the tree. Gear was all there, nothing missing. I walked a slow circle around the site, checking for tracks, but the ground was dry and full of leaves. I couldn't see anything clear. I felt exposed. Watched. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the tent, knife in my hand, staring at the ceiling. Every sound made me tense. I thought I heard whispering at one point. Not voices, just that sound leaves make when something brushes past them. I told myself I would leave in the morning. When dawn finally came, I packed everything in under an hour. My back ached and my legs felt weak, but I wanted out. I checked my GPS and set a course to backtrack. But not long after I started, I got turned around. The trail was gone. It had been clear before, narrow but clear. Now it was just brush and trees. I checked the GPS again, but the signal bounced in and out. I tried the emergency beacon, but the light blinked red. Weak signal. I told myself to stay calm. I turned around to go back to the campsite and try again. But I couldn't find the clearing either. Everything looked the same. Trees, dirt, rocks. I walked for 2 hours in a big circle and found nothing. No fire ring, no log, no tent, just more woods. I started to panic. I forced myself to sit and breathe. I ate a snack, drank water. Then I picked a direction and followed my compass south. I figured if I could reach the stream again, I could follow it back. After several hours, I found water. But it wasn't the same stream. This one was deeper, wider, and it flowed the wrong way. I camped there that night, terrified. I heard movement in the dark. Something big. Not close, but not far. I didn't sleep. I held the bear spray in one hand, knife in the other. My fire burned low, and I didn't have the energy to keep feeding it. The next morning, I moved fast. I barely ate. I followed the stream downhill for miles. My feet started to blister. My lips were cracked. I had enough water, but I was rationing food now. I had 2 days left, maybe 3 if I stretched it. I've done a lot of hiking over the years. Mountains, forests, deserts, you name it. I've always been the kind of guy who preferred being away from people, walking for miles in silence, just listening to my own thoughts and the wind through the trees. There's a peace to it, and sometimes, when life feels too loud, it's the only thing that calms me down. I usually go solo, not because I'm some expert or anything, just because I like being alone. But what happened last summer changed how I see solo hiking forever. It started with a trip to Montana. I had 2 weeks off from work and wanted something different. I looked online for some lesser-known trails that weren't packed with tourists. One name kept popping up in forums: Bridger Peak Spur Trail. A lot of people said it was underrated and quiet with beautiful views, but others mentioned how it wasn't very well maintained and that there were sections that weren't clearly marked. That should have been a red flag, but I was too stubborn. I liked the sound of a challenge. I arrived in Montana and spent the first couple of days doing some short hikes to warm up. Nothing crazy, just getting used to the altitude and the terrain. I was staying in a small motel near a town called Big Timber. Quiet place. Not many people, which I liked. The morning I left for Bridger Peak, the sky was clear. It was late June, warm but not too hot. I packed light but smart water, trail mix, a map I printed from an old hiking forum, a compass, a flashlight, a multi-tool, a jacket, and a first aid kit. I also had my phone, but I wasn't expecting any signal once I got deep into the trail. I wasn't planning to camp overnight, just hike up to the peak and back down before dark. The start of the trail was just how I hoped, empty and peaceful. It twisted through a forest of tall pines, the ground soft with old pine needles and fallen branches. The sun filtered through the leaves, making shifting patterns on the trail. For the first hour, I saw no one. No hikers, no animals, just birds chirping and the occasional rustling in the bushes. I kept a steady pace, stopping every now and then to drink water and take in the silence. As the trail climbed higher, the trees started to thin out. The view opened up to wide grassy meadows and jagged hills in the distance. It was beautiful, no doubt about it. There was a slight breeze, and the air smelled clean and sharp, like cold earth and sun-warmed grass. But around 3 hours in, I noticed something strange. The trail started to fade. It wasn't gone entirely, but it was less clear. Fewer footprints, less wear. The grass began to grow taller in patches across it. I pulled out my printed map, checked the compass, and figured I was still on the right track. According to what I read, there was a fork around here where the maintained trail ended, and a less used path continued up to Bridger Peak. That must have been what I hit. I shrugged it off and pushed on. The grass got higher, up to my waist in some places. The trail dipped into a shallow valley where the trees came back thick and close together. This is where things started to get uncomfortable. First, it was just a feeling, that tightness in your chest when something's off, but you don't know what. I told myself it was just the silence. No birds, no wind, nothing, just my own footsteps and breathing. I stopped and listened, hoping to hear water or animals or even insects, but there was nothing, dead quiet. I kept moving, but my steps slowed. The trail started curving in a strange way, bending away from the direction my compass said I should be going. I thought maybe it was just veering around a hill or a rocky patch, but it kept twisting, and I couldn't see any clear landmarks through the dense trees. Then I saw the first boot print. It was ahead of me, fresh in the soft dirt, and it didn't belong to me. Too large, wider sole. I stared at it, then looked around. No other footprints nearby, just that one. Pointed the way I was heading. I figured maybe someone else had been through here earlier in the day, but I hadn't seen a single soul since I started. Still, it was public land, and I wasn't the only hiker in Montana. I kept walking. 20 minutes later, I found something else. It was a piece of torn fabric hanging from a tree branch. Looked like nylon, maybe from a backpack or jacket. Faded blue. It fluttered in the breeze like a warning. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. No blood, no obvious damage. Maybe it just got snagged. But then I saw another boot print, same as before. Then another. The spacing looked strange. Long strides, like whoever made them was walking fast. Or running. I started to feel nervous. The trail was almost gone by this point. Just smashed grass and a few broken twigs that looked like someone else had passed through in a hurry. I wasn't sure if I should keep going or turn back, but I'd come too far to quit now. The peak couldn't be more than an hour away. The forest got darker. Not because of the time, it was still mid-afternoon, but because the trees here grew thicker. The trunks were blackened in places, like there'd been a fire long ago. No green moss, no birds. The ground felt soft, spongy in a way that made me uneasy. I kept thinking about those boot prints, about the torn fabric. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt watched, like something was nearby, just out of sight, following me. Then I heard it. Not loud, not close, but real. Something moving in the brush behind me, slow and steady. I stopped and waited. Nothing, just silence. I walked again. Then it moved too. I stopped. It stopped. This went on for a while, and my heart started pounding harder. I turned sharply and stared into the woods, trying to catch a shape or movement. Nothing but trees and shadows. I picked up the pace. I didn't run, but I walked faster, my eyes scanning the trees constantly. The trail was gone now, just raw forest. My compass needle bounced slightly as I moved, the terrain sloping up and down in strange ways that didn't match the map. Something was wrong. The forest felt wrong. The silence pressed against my ears like a weight. I came across something then that froze me in place. A campsite, old, half covered in leaves and moss. A fire pit full of ash and wet logs. A rusty pan hanging from a low branch. No tent, just a collapsed frame of poles and shredded tarp. The strangest thing was a pair of boots, sitting neatly side by side next to the pit, like someone had taken them off and never put them back on. I checked around for a trail marker or sign, but there was nothing. I looked for tracks but found none. I backed away and kept walking, even though I didn't know where I was anymore. The sun started to dip lower, shadows stretched longer, and my stomach started to ache from hunger. I reached for a granola bar, ate it while walking, but it did little to calm me down. My water bottle was half empty, and I still hadn't seen the peak. I considered stopping and camping for the night, but I didn't like the thought of sleeping here. Something felt off, deeply off. The worst moment came just before sunset. I heard something again. Footsteps, but not like before. These were heavier, closer. I turned fast, scanning the woods, but saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure move between the trees. Human-sized, too far to make out details. No sound. It just stood there, behind a tree half hidden. I froze. My brain told me to call out, but my mouth stayed shut. The figure didn't move. I stared for a full minute, heart hammering in my chest. Then it slowly backed behind the tree and vanished. I didn't hear it walk away. I ran. I didn't care about direction. I just ran, pushing through branches, stumbling over rocks and roots, slapping mosquitoes from my neck. I kept checking behind me, but I saw no one. When I finally stopped, I was out of breath, covered in cuts, and completely lost. The forest looked the same in every direction. I had no choice now. I had to find somewhere safe and stay put. I found a small clearing with a downed log and set up a crude shelter with my jacket and a space blanket from my first aid kit. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to attract anything or anyone. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I sat there, knees tucked to my chest, clutching my multi-tool in one hand and my flashlight in the other. Every crack of a branch made me flinch. Every gust of wind made me think someone was creeping toward me. I thought about my family, my job, all the things I might never see again. When the sky finally began to lighten, I didn't waste a second. I started walking. I checked my compass and headed south, hoping I'd eventually hit a road or trailhead. I moved fast, barely stopping. My legs burned, and I was thirsty, but I didn't care. After 5 hours of bushwhacking through dense forest, I heard it: water, a river or stream. I rushed toward it and found a narrow creek. I drank, filled my bottle, and followed the water downstream. Streams almost always lead to people, I told myself. 2 hours later, I saw it. A road, just a narrow dirt road cutting through the trees, but it felt like salvation. I stumbled onto it and kept walking until I saw a pickup truck parked near a bend. I took time off work last August to go on a solo hiking trip. I had been stressed for months. Too many hours behind a screen, answering emails, dealing with clients, and waking up to the same noise of traffic every day. I needed a reset, so I chose to go somewhere I hadn't been before. A place far from the city, surrounded by thick forest, hills, and silence. I found a trail system in a remote area about 4 hours from where I lived. It wasn't very popular. Most people who went there were locals or serious hikers. The trails were longer and harder, and you had to carry everything you needed since there were no nearby stores or ranger stations. That's exactly what I wanted. Peace, solitude, nature. I packed carefully, lightweight gear, enough food for a few days, water filters, a GPS, map, compass, tent, sleeping bag, extra batteries, knife, flashlight, first aid kit. I went over the list again and again. I didn't want to take any chances. I drove out early one morning and reached the small parking area by noon. It was just a gravel patch off a dirt road. My car was the only one there. The forest was quiet. No cell service. No buildings. Just tall trees and the sound of birds. I locked up the car, strapped on my backpack, and started walking. The trail I had planned was a loop, about 32 miles total. I figured I'd take 3 days to finish it, moving slowly and enjoying the quiet. The first few hours were perfect. The trail was overgrown in some spots, but it was marked by orange paint blazes on the trees. I stopped to take pictures, refilled my bottle at a creek using my filter, and even saw deer a few times. I felt relaxed. That first night, I set up my tent by a stream. I cooked a small meal, sat by the water, and watched the light fade through the trees. There was no one else around. No voices, no lights, just wind and insects. I slept well that night, and I felt even better the next morning. It was going exactly as I had hoped. The second day, I planned to hike another 10 to 12 miles and camp again before finishing the loop on the third day. I woke up early, made oatmeal, packed up my gear, and followed the trail deeper into the woods. But somewhere around mid-morning, I noticed something strange. The orange blazes that marked the trail started to look older. They were faint, almost like they hadn't been painted in years. Some trees had no markings at all. I assumed I had just hit a less maintained section of the trail. Then I saw a fork, 2 paths. One had a faded orange mark. The other had a newer, brighter orange blaze. Without thinking too much, I followed the newer mark. It looked more recently used. I figured maybe the trail had been rerouted, or maybe I was merging with a different segment of the loop. That was a mistake. First, the trail was fine, but after an hour or two, it started to narrow. The brush got thicker. I had to push past branches and duck under dead trees. I didn't see any more trail markers, but I kept going. I thought maybe it would open up ahead. Didn't. Eventually, I realized I wasn't on any trail at all. I had been following a game path, probably made by deer or elk. It looked like a trail at first, but now it was barely a foot wide. No blazes, no signs, just trees. I stopped and looked around. Everything looked the same. Tall trees, thick undergrowth, no landmarks. I took out my GPS. The signal was weak. It showed my general location, but not the trail. I tried to orient myself using my map and compass, but I wasn't sure which direction I had come from. I had walked so long in one direction that I had stopped paying attention. I thought about turning back, but I wasn't sure where the fork had been. I hadn't marked it. Still, I tried. I turned around and walked the way I thought I had come. After 30 minutes, I didn't recognize anything. No sign of the game trail. No fork. Just more trees. I wasn't scared yet, but I was getting nervous. I stopped, took off my pack, drank some water, and sat on a fallen log. I told myself to stay calm. I had supplies. I had gear. I wasn't hurt. I just needed to retrace my steps or figure out a way back to the trail. People got turned around all the time in the woods. I just had to think clearly. I decided to keep moving, hoping I'd run into the main trail. I checked the sun, chose a direction, and walked slowly, stopping every few minutes to mark trees with bits of orange tape from my pack. That way, if I had to turn back again, I'd know where I came from. But the forest kept stretching in every direction. No trail, no signs, just endless trees, ferns, and dry branches crunching under my boots. After 3 hours, I still hadn't found anything. My legs were getting sore. My feet hurt. The sun was starting to dip. I needed to set up camp before it got too dark. I found a small flat area near a rocky ridge and pitched my tent. I was careful with everything. Tied up my food in a bear bag and hung it from a high branch, double-checked my gear, and made sure my flashlight worked. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound outside made me sit up. I kept thinking about the miles of forest around me and how no one knew exactly where I was. The next morning, I tried to use my GPS again. The signal came and went. It gave me a general direction, but no trail overlay. I decided to try heading west, hoping I'd hit the original loop trail or maybe even the access road eventually. I walked for hours again, stopping only for water and short rests. The terrain got harder. Hills, dense brush. Some parts were so thick I had to crawl. My legs were scratched. My arms too. I slipped at one point trying to cross a stream and twisted my ankle, but it wasn't serious. Just sore. By mid-afternoon, I hadn't found anything. My water was running low. I filtered more from a muddy creek. I kept walking, hoping to see a sign, a blaze, anything that told me I was close to the trail again. Nothing. I camped again that night. I was more tired, hungrier. I had food, but I was starting to ration it, just in case. The next day, I woke up feeling heavy. My body ached. My ankle was worse, swollen. I wrapped it with a bandage from my kit. I couldn't move as fast anymore. I kept going west, or what I thought was west. I saw animal tracks, heard rustling. At one point, I saw something in the distance, a shape. I thought it was a person, but when I got closer, it was just a tree stump. Then the rain started. It wasn't heavy at first, but it got worse by the hour. Cold, steady rain. It soaked everything. My clothes, my boots, my pack. The forest floor turned to mud. I slipped multiple times. My flashlight got water inside and flickered. The wind picked up. I set up my tent late that day, shivering, wet, and cold. I barely ate. I curled into my sleeping bag, teeth chattering, and tried to stay warm. That night, I thought I heard something outside the tent. Heavy steps, not a small animal, something big. I held my knife tight in one hand, but nothing happened, just noises in the dark. I woke up to silence. The rain had stopped, but the trees were still dripping. I stepped out and saw that my food bag had been torn down. Bits of wrappers and crumbs were scattered. Something had gotten into it. Most of my food was gone. I cursed myself for not tying it high enough. Now I had less than a day's worth of food. I knew I couldn't stay out there much longer. My ankle was worse. My energy was low. I had to find a way out. I forced myself to keep moving, limping now, pushing through the trees. By that afternoon, I finally found something. A broken fence. Just old wooden posts and rusted wire. But it meant I was near something man-made. I followed it, carefully, slowly. After an hour, I saw a clearing through the trees. Then, in the distance, a structure, an old cabin or maybe a hunting shack. It was empty, no one around, but it had a tin roof, a small porch, and a door that creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, it was dusty, cobwebs, rotten smell, but there were signs someone had used it before. A broken chair, empty cans, some old matches. No food, but I felt safer just being inside. I stayed there that night. I built a small fire in the old fireplace, using dry wood I found under the porch. I dried my clothes, let my ankle rest, ate the last of my food. The next morning, I climbed a hill behind the cabin, hoping to get a better view. And that's when I saw it. A road, far in the distance, maybe 2 miles away. A dirt road, but clearly used. I could just make out a tire track through the trees. That gave me strength I hadn't felt in days. I went back, packed everything, and started walking. It took me almost 4 hours to reach the road. My ankle was throbbing. I had to stop often, but I made it. And just an hour later, a truck came by, an old pickup. I stepped out and waved. The driver stopped, confused at first, then asked if I was all right. I don't remember exactly why I picked that trail. It wasn't famous or well-reviewed. It didn't even have a proper name, just a numbered designation on a weathered wooden sign. Trail number 49. It was buried somewhere deep in a national forest about 4 hours from the city. I had found it while scrolling through a forum where people shared hidden hikes that didn't attract crowds. I didn't want crowds. I just wanted to be alone, away from work, noise, and people. It was late September, and the forest had started turning. The leaves were gold and orange, crisping on the edges. That perfect stretch when the air feels cooler, but the sun still warms your back. I packed 2 days' worth of food, a water filter, my tent, extra socks, a flashlight with backup batteries, a knife, and a power bank for emergencies. I left my car at a tiny dirt pull-off with enough room for maybe 2 vehicles. There weren't any other cars. That should have told me something. The first few miles of the hike were peaceful. Pines stood like guards along both sides of the trail. The dirt was soft with fallen needles. I saw squirrels darting through undergrowth, birds hopping from branch to branch. I took a few photos of moss-covered logs and a small stream cutting across the trail. The air smelled clean, earthy, like wet bark and cold stone. It was quiet except for my boots and the occasional wind in the branches. About 5 miles in, the trail started climbing. The trees thinned a bit. The sun flickered through the leaves in patches. I kept going, sweating a little now. The silence started getting to me. There was something about how it felt. Not peaceful anymore, just empty. My footsteps echoed more than I liked. And every now and then, I thought I heard one that wasn't mine. I would stop and look back. Nothing. Maybe a falling acorn, a rustle of a rabbit. I told myself that. I made camp at a flat patch near a boulder with a weird white mark across it. It looked almost like a scar. I didn't think much of it then. I pitched my tent, heated some soup, and watched the forest grow darker around me. I ate slowly, listened to the leaves brushing against each other above me, and checked my phone. No signal. That wasn't a surprise. I powered it off to save battery. It got dark fast. The kind of dark where you can't even see your hand without a flashlight. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and lay there listening. Every snap of a twig outside made me freeze. I wasn't scared exactly, just alert. It's funny how your brain tunes in when it's quiet. You hear everything. The tiny footfalls of mice, the wind moving across the treetops, and sometimes things you can't place. That night, I barely slept. Around 3 a.m., I heard something heavy move past the tent. It wasn't fast. It was slow, careful. Each step sunk into the forest floor with a soft thump. I held my breath, my hand wrapped around my knife. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't move. I just lay there until the steps faded. I told myself it was a deer or a bear, something normal, but I never heard sniffing. No pawing at the tent. It just walked past. In the morning, I stepped outside and looked around. No tracks. The pine needles were too thick to show prints. I packed up and kept walking. I told myself I was fine, just spooked from sleeping alone in the woods. The trail narrowed, less maintained now. Bushes grew thick on both sides. Spiderwebs hung between branches. I started using a stick to swipe in front of me. The terrain grew steeper. The ground was dry and crumbled under my boots sometimes. I slipped twice, once grabbing onto a branch to stop my fall. The branch cracked, but held. By noon, the trees started to open up. I could see farther now, down into a deep valley, thick with green. The trail skirted the edge of a drop that was maybe 30, 40 feet straight down. There were no rails, no signs, just dirt and the edge. One wrong step and you'd fall hard. I didn't like that part. As I walked along the edge, I kept my eyes on my boots. One foot, then the other. The dirt looked dry, too dry, felt brittle beneath me. I moved slow. My backpack shifted on my shoulders. I adjusted the straps and kept going. About a mile in, I came to a spot where the trail was gone. It had collapsed, maybe from a recent storm or just time. The edge had crumbled into a steep slope of broken earth, roots, and loose rock. I looked around. To the right was the drop. To the left was thick forest and no path. Going back would mean losing all that ground I covered. So I tried to go forward. I stepped carefully across where the trail used to be. The ground tilted under me. My boots slid, and I dropped to one knee to balance. Dirt kicked up and tumbled down the slope. My heart thudded in my chest. I grabbed a root sticking out of the side and pulled myself forward, crawling until I reached the other side. I sat there for a minute, catching my breath. My hands shook. From there, the trail kept going, but it was thinner. Fewer signs of people. No boot prints, no broken branches. Just trees pressing close and silence. I should have turned back. I didn't. I walked another 2 miles before I noticed the first strange thing. It was a tent. Old, collapsed, faded orange fabric shredded by time and weather. Poles broken, half buried in the ground. Moss grew around the base. I crouched to look. Inside were scraps, an old sock, torn nylon, rusted cans. I couldn't tell how long it had been there. Years maybe. I stood up and looked around. No trail markers. No sign anyone had been here recently. I kept moving. The next odd thing was a boot. Just one. Sitting upright beside the trail like someone had taken it off and left it there. It wasn't that old. Still held its shape. Laces still tied. A little dirty, but not weather-worn like the tent. I looked around again. No one. I didn't like how quiet it was. It wasn't just peaceful anymore. It felt hollow, like the forest was holding its breath. Then I saw the first marker, a strip of red cloth tied to a branch. It fluttered slightly in the wind. I walked up and touched it. Nylon, bright, clean, not old. Someone had marked something here. I saw another one ahead, and then another. They led off the main trail. I followed. The path bent and twisted through thick brush. I ducked under branches, stepped over logs. More red markers led the way. I don't know why I kept going. Curiosity, maybe, or stupidity. The trail ended at a ridge. Below me was a steep slope that led to a narrow ravine. And at the bottom of it, something metal, a flash of silver. I squinted. It looked like a piece of equipment. A cooking pot, maybe. I hesitated, then started down. The slope was slick. I grabbed at branches to keep balance. Dirt slid under my boots. Halfway down, I slipped and landed hard. My knee hit a rock. I swore under my breath, but kept going. At the bottom, I saw the source of the shine. It was a small camp, old again, not like the first tent. This one was set deeper into the trees. Tarp strung between trees, half collapsed. Fire ring long cold. Gear scattered. Ripped backpack, rusted knife, torn blanket. It looked like whoever stayed here had left in a hurry, or hadn't left at all. I stepped closer and saw something that made my stomach twist. A cracked plastic phone, faded by sun, covered in dirt, still lying screen up like someone dropped it. Beside it, claw marks. Not animal claw marks. Not deep enough. More like someone had dug into the dirt with their hands. I looked closer. Fingernail marks, scraped into the earth. Long lines. Frantic. I backed away. The forest was dead quiet. I turned around and climbed back up the slope. Fast. My heart thudding. Branches grabbed at my sleeves. Dirt slid under me again. I reached the top and didn't stop walking. I didn't care about the red markers anymore. I just wanted the main trail. I found it again after maybe 15 minutes of stumbling through brush. I turned back toward the direction I came from. I wanted out. The sun was dropping. The shadows stretched longer. I kept moving. Every now and then, I thought I heard footsteps, like just behind me. I stopped once and listened. Nothing, just wind. I started walking faster. When I reached the spot where the trail had collapsed earlier, I stopped. It looked worse now. More of the edge had given way. The path was thinner. The route I used earlier to pull myself across was gone, torn out or broken. I looked at the gap. It was wider now, too wide to safely cross. No way forward, no way back. I stared at it, my breath short. The drop was steep. If I fell, I'd break something, maybe everything. I had to find another way. I stepped off the trail into the woods, trying to skirt around the washout. The brush was thick. Thorns tore at my sleeves. I pushed through. I don't really know why I decided to take that trip alone. I think part of me wanted to clear my head. I'd been stuck in a boring routine for months. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, same thing every day. I hadn't taken a real break in over a year, and I thought getting outside would help. I liked hiking, though I hadn't done it in a while, and figured it'd be good to get back into it. No distractions, just me, the woods, and the quiet. I picked a place up north in Idaho. It was far enough away from the city to feel like an escape, but not so remote that I'd need a guide. I researched a national forest where there were trails of all kinds, short hikes, multi-day routes, even some with backcountry camping spots. I planned a 2-night hike that looped around a lake and passed through several ridges and thick forest. According to maps and online blogs, it was about 20 miles total. I figured I could do it in 3 days if I took my time. The weather forecast looked good: clear skies, mild temps, no storms. I packed everything I thought I'd need: my tent, sleeping bag, water filter, food, first aid kit, GPS watch, paper map, and even a backup battery. I had signal in parts of the trail, but I knew I couldn't rely on that. I made sure to download offline maps too. I parked my car at the trailhead around 10 in the morning on a Friday. There were a few other vehicles, but not many. It wasn't peak season. Most people didn't like hiking too far into the backcountry when the nights still got cold. I signed in at the trail register near the start, shouldered my pack, and set off. The first few miles were easy, gentle elevation, a wide path, the kind of hike that lets you settle into a rhythm. The forest was thick but beautiful. Tall pines, the smell of dirt and needles, birds chirping above. I took my time, stopping now and then to take pictures or drink water. I saw a few hikers on their way back, probably doing shorter loops. We nodded, but no one stopped to chat. By the time I made it to my first campsite near the lake, it was late afternoon. The sun was still up, but the shadows had grown longer. The lake was calm and empty. No one else had set up camp. I found a flat patch of ground just above the shoreline and pitched my tent. I cooked a simple dinner with my little stove, filtered water, and sat on a log watching the lake ripple in the breeze. It was peaceful, more peaceful than I'd felt in months. That night, I slept hard, the kind of sleep where you wake up and don't know what time it is. I only stirred once when I thought I heard something walking near the tent, but it was probably a raccoon or something. I went back to sleep. The next day, I woke up early, made coffee, packed up, and started on the trail again. This section was a little more rugged. The terrain got steeper and the trees grew denser. The trail itself was narrower and harder to follow in spots, but my GPS matched what I saw on the map. I was still on the right path. I kept going. Around midday, I came to a fork in the trail that I wasn't expecting. There were no signs. One path was more worn down, clearly used more often. The other was narrower, almost hidden under brush. I checked my map and GPS, but they weren't clear about this fork. The GPS line sort of drifted between the two, and I couldn't tell which was right. I stood there for a while trying to figure it out. Eventually, I took the narrower path. I don't know why. Maybe it felt like more of an adventure, or maybe I just assumed it was the right way and hadn't been used recently. First, it was fine. A little harder to follow, but still a trail. I hiked for another hour or so. Then the trail started disappearing. The brush got thicker. Branches scratched my arms. I had to duck under fallen trees and step over rocks that didn't feel like they belonged on a trail. I started to feel like maybe I'd gone the wrong way. I stopped, checked my map again. The GPS showed me drifting away from the original route, but I figured if I kept going a little further, I'd reconnect with the main trail. It looked like it looped around eventually, but the deeper I went, the worse it got. The trail was completely gone now. It was just forest, thick, overgrown, and quiet in a way that didn't feel right. No wind, no birds, just the sound of my own boots crunching leaves. I should have turned back, but I thought I could still find the main trail again if I kept going. Then I slipped. It happened fast. I stepped on what I thought was solid ground, but it gave way beneath me. It wasn't a huge fall, maybe 6 or 7 feet down a slope, but I landed hard. My knee twisted under me, and my shoulder slammed into a rock. I let out a groan and just lay there for a second. I tried to stand, but my right knee buckled. The pain shot up my leg, sharp and deep. I sat back down, breathing hard. My hands were scraped, and my arm throbbed from where it hit the rock. I checked for bleeding. Nothing serious, but my knee was swollen already. I tried standing again and could barely put weight on it. Panic started to creep in. I was off the trail. I didn't know where I was, and now I couldn't walk properly. I pulled out my phone. No signal. Of course, I checked my GPS. It still worked, but the battery was low, less than 20%. I cursed myself for not charging it fully the night before. I pulled out my paper map, but without knowing exactly where I was, it wasn't much help. The terrain around me didn't look like anything marked clearly. I was just somewhere deep in the forest, off trail, with an injured leg. I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to think. I had supplies: food, water, a tent, a first aid kit. I wasn't in immediate danger. I just need to stay put, rest my leg, and try again in the morning. Maybe I could backtrack with the GPS if the battery lasted. I found a small flat area near the base of the slope and set up my tent. I took painkillers, wrapped my knee, and lay down. That night was worse. It got cold, much colder than the night before. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, but it didn't help much. My knee throbbed. Every time I moved, the pain flared up. And then there were the sounds. Not animals, not wind. I heard something walking around the tent. Slow steps, crunching leaves. I froze. It circled once, then stopped. I held my breath, every muscle tense. After a long time, I didn't hear anything else. I don't think I slept at all. When morning came, I unzipped the tent slowly and looked outside. Nothing, just forest. But something felt off, like the air was heavier. I couldn't explain it. I tried standing. My knee was still bad, but I could hobble a bit. I packed up slowly and tried to retrace my steps, using the GPS to guide me. That's when I realized I was in real trouble. The forest didn't look the same. I couldn't find the slope I fell from. Everything looked different. No trail, just trees and rocks and more trees. The GPS still worked, but it wasn't helping. It just showed me drifting through nowhere. I didn't know which way was correct. I kept moving anyway. Hours passed. My leg got worse. I fell twice. The second time, I landed on my side and lay there for a while, staring up at the sky through the trees. I was tired, thirsty, hungry, scared, and I felt stupid. So stupid. I knew better than this. I knew not to go off trail. I set up camp again that night. I was down to a granola bar and some jerky. My water was low. I could filter more, but I hadn't come across a stream in hours. That night, I didn't even bother trying to sleep. I just sat in the tent listening, and I heard it again. Footsteps, slower this time, closer. They came, stopped outside the tent, then left. I didn't move. I was too afraid. In the morning, I checked again. Nothing. No prints, no broken branches, no sign of anything. But I knew I'd heard it. The third day was the worst. I was limping badly now. My food was gone. I found a muddy stream and filtered water, but it tasted awful. I kept going in what I thought was the right direction, but I had no way of knowing. The GPS died before noon. My paper map was useless without context. Then I saw the cabin. It was deep in the trees, half hidden by brush and moss. I almost didn't see it. It looked old, gray wood, sagging roof, a broken window. I didn't want to go near it. Something about it felt wrong. But I needed shelter. I needed to rest. So I went closer. The door creaked open with a shove. Inside, it was dark and musty, empty except for an old table and a broken chair. Cobwebs hung from the corners. It hadn't been used in years, but it was dry. I sat up in the corner and lay down, hoping to rest a bit before moving on. That's when I noticed the carvings. On the walls near the door, someone had scratched words into the wood. Faint, hard to read, but I could make out a few. Help. Trapped. No way out. I backed away. I didn't sleep that night. I heard footsteps again, but this time they didn't stop outside. They came up to the door, then silence. I waited for it to open. It never did. In the morning, I ran. Limped, really. I just had to get